بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم إن الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا من يهده الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله صلى الله عليه وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم تسليما كثيرا. أما بعد. Inshallah, ikhwah, just a reminder, inshallah, from the last lesson that we had. We spoke a little bit about the different categorizations of speech and the relevance that that knowledge plays, especially when it comes to understanding the Quran and the Sunnah and the tradition. We also spoke about how it's further categorized. So we kind of gave examples of how categorizations lead to further categorizations, because it's a very complex science and understanding it requires a lot of depth. So there's a lot of depth when it comes to understanding what type of language is utilized, because this is the medium in which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala chose to speak to humanity. So we need to be able to understand exactly what the murad is, muradullah. So what is Allah's intent through His words? Okay? Because human language is complex. I can say something to you, and I can give you a certain expression with my face, or I can give you a certain, I can build a certain context. And I can say the exact same words without any change whatsoever to somebody else, and it'll mean two completely different things. So it's really important for us to look at it and understand it in that way. So because of the complexity that exists in human language, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala choosing this language in order to communicate what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's desire is and His will and His divine decree to human beings, then it's important for us to be able to understand and to clarify what exactly does it mean and what exactly is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala telling us. So we spoke a little bit about the categorizations of speech. We spoke about a little bit about Arabic grammar, nouns. We spoke about verbs. We spoke about the particulars. We spoke about a literal understanding. We spoke about metaphorical understanding. Does it exist in the Quran? Does it not exist in the Quran? We gave examples of the fact that it does exist in the Quran. We spoke about a difference of opinion within the tradition last week, speaking about when some of the Imam of the past, from some of the early traditions, mentioned how there was no metaphorical understanding whatsoever in Quran, and no wording in the Quran or phrase or verse or whatever, or noun or whatever formulation of word exists in the Quran, none of it could be described as metaphorical in any way whatsoever. But then when you explain to them what does X, Y, Z mean, they said, yeah, but that's not metaphorical. So really it's a difference of opinion in semantics, but the reality remains the same. So we spoke a little bit about that as well. And then we left at the area or at the section in which we were giving a definition of al-majaz. So al-majaz is a metaphorical. What does metaphor mean? And it's especially important for us to understand, because this is something which gives us some clarity into the Quran and where and when is it used in Quran. The author mentions, قال المؤلف رحمه الله ونفعنا الله بعلومه في الدارين آمين وأما المجاز فحده ما نقل عما وضع له. So the author, he says, as for metaphor, okay, he says, فحده, its definition is that which has been transferred away or taken away from the original intended meaning in its application. We spoke a little bit about this last week already, okay? So you have a word that means something in any language that we speak, okay? It has a meaning. What happens if that meaning is transferred and it means something completely different? So now it means something completely different from what it used to mean in the past. How do you define the new meaning and how do you define the old meaning? Is the old meaning still applicable? So for example, if that word is used, can we ever, for whatever circumstance or scenario or situation, can it ever apply to the old meaning again, or is it completely disconnected from that meaning, never to be utilized for that understanding ever again? For example, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He mentions in the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He says, وَصَلِّ عَلَيْهِمْ إِنَّ صَلَاتَكَ سَكَنٌ لَهُمْ in Surah At-Tawbah. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, خُذْ مِنْ أَمْوَالِهِمْ صَدَقَةً تُطَهِّرُهُمْ بِهَا. Take from their wealth a charity, some charity, so that they may be purified, i.e. so that their sins could be purified, so that it can be an expiation for them. Then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, وَصَلِّ عَلَيْهِمْ إِنَّ صَلَاتَكَ سَكَنٌ لَهُمْ. If I were to ask any of you today, what does the word salah mean in the Arabic language? Most of you would say to me, it means the prayer. And that's how we understand it to mean, because that's the meaning that it's assumed, it's appropriated that meaning. Whatever meaning it had in the past, if I say to you, what does salah mean to you? You tell to me it means the prayer that we pray. That's obvious. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala doesn't use that word over here for that meaning. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying, pray, make dua for them. So the original meaning of the word salah meant prayer, meant supplication, meant dua. But the fact that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala still uses that word shows you that there isn't a disconnect from the original intended meaning. So that relationship still exists. So that's why many of the usuliyin, many of the fuqaha, they say a definition, even if it incorporates a new meaning, has to have some connection to the original intended meaning. So for example, when we pray salah, do we supplicate in the salah? Do we make dua in the salah? Absolutely we do, isn't it? We do make dua, we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for forgiveness, we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for the paradise, we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala we seek refuge in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala from the hellfire. So all of those things incorporate what we understand to be as a supplication. Therefore, the new meaning of salah still incorporates remnants or the entirety even of its original intended meaning and more. So it's what we call the meaning was ziyadat. Some of the scholars who mention that there is no new meaning in language and language doesn't incorporate new meaning, what they would say is no, any new meaning or any metaphor or anything is just a reflection of the previous understanding, previous word, an extra addition, an additional series of understandings to what was mentioned in the past. But it's really the same reality. But it's really interesting for us to understand it in that way. So what is the nature of al-majaz? We're going to do that inshallah today. So the author says, وَأَمَّا الْمَجَازُ فَحَدُّهُ مَا نُقِلَ عَمَّا وُضِعَ لَهُ. So al-majaz or metaphor, okay, means its intention, its definition is, that which has been transferred away from its original intended meaning to something completely different. Then he says, وَقَدْ يَكُونُ, and this transference, meaning moving away from its original intended meaning, can happen in different ways. So it's not only in one way that it can happen in different ways. The author says, وَقَدْ يَكُونُ ذَلِكَ بِزِيَادَةٍ. Sometimes that can be by an addition, adding something onto it. So the original intended meaning could remain, but it has an extra addition. It has something that's added onto it. So then he says, وَنُقْصَانٍ, or it could have something that's taken away from it. Okay, so it can have an addition, or it could have something that's taken away. وَتَقْدِيمٍ, or it could have something which is what the author says as وَتَقْدِيمُ وَتَأْخِيرٍ. تَقْدِيم وَتَأْخِير means it's a type of play with language. So for rhetorical purpose, you can twist a word around and you can put one word that's supposed to be in the beginning and you put it towards the end, and a word that's supposed to be at the end, you put it towards the beginning. And there's examples of that in the Quran, and we'll mention that inshallah. Then he says, وَاسْتِعَارَةٍ, or a word which is borrowed. So a word which is borrowed is put in a place where in normal circumstances it shouldn't be. So it's a borrowed word. These are all examples of metaphor in Quran. So the author gives examples and he says, فَالزِّيَادَةُ, an example of adding something onto a verse in Quran. That's in actual fact in the Arabic it doesn't really change anything. If you were to take the addition away, it doesn't really have much of an impact. But it's classified as that. So the author, he says, فَالزِّيَادَةُ كَقَوْلِهِ جَلَّ فِي عُلَى وَعَزَّ وَجَلَّ لَيْسَ كَمِثْلِهِ شَيْءٍ. The author, he says, وَالْمَعْنَى لَيْسَ مِثْلَهُ شَيْءٍ وَالْكَافُ زَائِدَةٌ. So the author, he says, the kaf, لَيْسَ كَمِثْلِهِ شَيْءٍ. That kaf, that's an extra addition onto the verse in Quran. It's an addition by Allah, of course. Nobody else, it's not a human addition. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala added that into the verse. Whereas, does the verse necessitate, in order to complete its meaning, does it necessitate that harf or that particular to be in that verse in Quran? According to the author, he's saying, no, that's not the case. But then why is this classified as metaphor then? For what reason would this be classified as a metaphor? So it's something that's been added on to a meaning where it's not needed. So it's an addition. So it's something which is an addition. If you take it away, can the meaning still be preserved? That's the question. What do you think? If we took out that kaf completely, and I said, لَيْسَ مِثْلَهُ شَيْءٍ, what do you think? The meaning is preserved, sah? But according to some of the ulama, they say, there is a meaning even though the essence of the meaning remains, that addition in of in itself could have some significance. Because kaf is a harf or a particular that's used in similitude, they say Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is emphasizing more than what's needed to show that really, in absolute fact, there is nothing like unto Allah. There is nothing like Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So even though it's an addition, it is an addition that can signify the meaning, but if you take it away, the meaning is somewhat preserved. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is using it for emphasis. So it's emphasizing something. That's where the metaphor lies. وَالنُّقْصَانِ, what about al-nuqsan? Taking something away. كَقَوْلِهِ, the author, he says, كَقَوْلِهِ تَعَالَى, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, and we gave you this example in a previous week, وَاسْأَلِ الْقَرْيَةِ. So when the sons of Yusuf alayhi salam, they wanted to justify to their father and give them a good, a viable reason as to why they lost their other younger brother, the youngest brother. They wanted to explain to their father what happened, and they said, you know what, if you don't believe us, وَاسْأَلِ الْقَرْيَةِ الَّتِي كُنَّا فِيهَا. وَاسْأَلِ الْقَرْيَةَ الَّتِي كُنَّا فِيهَا. Ask the town that we were in. What does that mean? So it's taken something away. What has it taken away? أهل القرية, the people of the town. So there's something that's missing. وَاسْأَلِ الْقَرْيَةِ, it's supposed to be وَاسْأَلْ أَهْلِ الْقَرْيَةِ. But the fact that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala used it in such a way, you don't ask a town, because a town does not speak. A town is made up of buildings, and it's made up of planned structures, and it's made up of people who inhabit the town. That's what a town is made of, and a village and a city. Okay? But you don't ask, there's no concept of a city that you ask. So when you say go and ask the town, if you don't believe me, go and ask the town. Go and visit that town and see what the town is telling you. Go to the town and see what secrets the town reveals. If I were to say that to you, you know for a fact I'm not saying that the town itself is going to say to you, hello, Fulan, come here and I'm going to reveal myself to you. Nobody understands it in that way. You understand it in a very metaphorical sense, which is exactly what the Quran is portraying. So the Quran is teaching us that metaphor exists in the Arabic language and it's accepted, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala himself uses it in Quran. Okay? So nobody understood that to mean actually going to ask the town and asking the bricks and asking the buildings and asking what we understand a town to be. But it means the people and the inhabitants of the town. So that's an example of something or a word that's been taken away for rhetorical effect. So that's metaphor being used. So then he says, وَالْمُرَادُ بِهِ, that which is intended by this verse is أَهْلَ الْقَرْيَةِ, is the people or the inhabitants of the town. And he mentions and he gives what we would refer as a grammatical reason or justification. So the author, he says, فَحُذِفَ الْمُضَافِ وَأَقَامَ الْمُضَافُ إِلَيْهِ مَقَامَهُ. So the author, he says the mudaf, okay? So in Arabic, you have something which is called mudaf and mudaf ilayh. You can't have the mudaf by itself because it's supposed to signify something that comes after. Okay? So you have something which is an indicator. So the mudaf is an indicator and mudaf ilayh is something which is indicating. So if you take away the mudaf, okay, usually in normal circumstance that doesn't happen unless it's for a rhetorical effect and for metaphor. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, what he did was he took away the mudaf, which is ahl, and he left the mudaf ilayh, which is the qarya. Okay? So the qarya is that which is being indicated, and that which is indicating is the people. And that's been taken away. فَحُذِفَ الْمُضَافِ وَأَقَامَ الْمُضَافُ إِلَيْهِ مَقَامَهُ. But sometimes, for rhetorical effect, the mudaf ilayh can encompass the meaning. That's how we understood it. So the reason why we know, and we don't need to ask anybody, that this is referring to Ahl al-Qarya is because the mudaf ilayh, was'al al-Qarya, the word al-Qarya tells us already that there's a mudaf that's missing over here. And that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is referring to the people of the town. We understand that automatically. So the author says, وَالْمُرَادُ بِهِ أَهْلَ الْقَرْيَةِ, that which is intended is Ahl al-Qarya, the people or the inhabitants of the town. فَحُذِفَ, and the mudaf was taken away. And that which took its position is that which has been it was indicating, or it was pointing to, or is referring to, which is the mudaf ilayh. Okay? So then he says, وَالتَّقْدِيمُ وَالتَّأْخِيرُ, placing something in front and putting something behind. So swapping around a word which in normal circumstances would take precedence and delaying it in the sequence. So the author, he gives an example, كقوله, like when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he says, وَالَّذِي أَخْرَجَ الْمَرْعَى فَجَعَلَهُ غُثَاءً أَحْوَى. What does غُثَاء mean? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling us in this verse how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala creates life on earth. When I say on earth, meaning the earth itself. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he says to us that when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he caused the rain to descend, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he causes out what pasture to come out. Okay? So all of the greenery and all of the earth, its beauty comes out through Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's recreation of the earth. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, فَجَعَلَهُ, then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala causes it to غُثَاء, to become nothing. Okay? Or to dry out completely. Ahwa. Then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says ahwa. Ahwa is when something comes out green. So there's two ways of understanding. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is either telling us that the earth is recycled, which is also true, that this is a cycle which happens of life and death, which is the reality of our existence. So our existence is all about life and death. Every time someone passes away, someone's being born. The entire journey of life is one in which there's a cycle of life and death. And life would not be able to continue unless death existed. Okay? So that's one understanding. Another understanding is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is speaking about how he causes the process of the earth to cause it to live again after its death. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala speaks about the pasture coming out. Then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he mentions what? He mentions its dissipation and its complete ruin again. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala speaks about the greenery again. But what it should be, not what it should be, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, what he mentioned is the way it should be. But the way of the sequence is وَالَّذِي أَخْرَجَ الْمَرْعَى أَحْوَى فَجَعَلَهُ غُثَاء. That's how it's supposed to be, normal sequence. But because of rhetorical effect and the way the metaphors being used, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala used the language in this way to employ a meaning away from the way it's supposed to be, the normal way in which it's supposed to have been said. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said it in a completely different way. But we still understand what the meaning is. Then he says, وَالْمُرَادُ بِهِ, that which is intended, is أَخْرَجَ الْمَرْعَى أَحْوَى. Is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he causes the pasture to come out and the greenery to come out in strength. Then فَجَعَلَهُ غُثَاء. Then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala causes it to die and to dissipate and to deteriorate. Then he says, فَقَدَّمَ وأخر. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He used what was called precedence and delay. Something which was in normal circumstances, language which should have been delayed, Allah caused it to be precede, and that which should have preceded, Allah caused it to delay in language. This is very important because in normal circumstances, that's not how language is employed. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is teaching us, we will know through Quran, that the reason why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says it in such a way is to cause rhetorical effect and use metaphor in order to give significance and understanding for people who have understanding. What about borrowing? What about borrowing? Can a word be borrowed that's not supposed to be utilized and just be put in a place where it's not supposed to be in normal circumstances? That's used for rhetorical effect also. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He says, وَالْإِسْتَعَارَةُ, or borrowing a word, كَقَوْلِهِ تَعَالَى, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He says in the Quran, جِدَارًا يُرِيدُ أَن يَنْقَضَّ, and we mentioned this quite a few times. A wall which wishes or wants to fall over. We all know that our wall does not have a desire or an intention. And in actual, if you really think about it, is everything in creation a sentient being? That's a whole new discussion, really. Like, for example, this microphone, this table, this phone, the wall, the roof, all of the things in which we assume not to be sentient beings and things which have feelings or things. What do you think? Is there an essence in which, is there some level of consciousness that they possess? Plants, trees. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions that He gives them life, isn't it? So if they have life, what does life mean? To give something life, what does it mean? Does it mean that there has to be some level of consciousness, some kind of a connection with the earth? Is there any aspect of them being able to interact with what is around them? So that's something which is interesting. And many of the ulama actually used to believe that everything in existence is sentient by nature. So when you pluck a plant from its roots, that actually causes the plant pain. It feels the pain. Even though we can't hear it, it's screaming. It's screaming and it's crying. So it's causing it pain. It feels everything that we feel as human beings. And because we're not conscious to that, we don't give it any consideration or any significance. So long as I can't hear it, it doesn't really matter. That's the narcissism that we have as human beings. But that's just the reality of what it is. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you say, jidaran yurid. So it has irada, it has a desire, it has an intention, it has a will. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala uses that word. But what is meant isn't what the word actually reflects. The word is being used in a different way. Therefore, that's why it's a metaphor. The author says, فَاسْتَعَارَ, so the word, فَاسْتَعَارَ فِيهِ لَفْظُ الْإِرَادَةِ. So the irada or the intent was a word which was borrowed. So it was a word which was borrowed. وَمَا مِن مَجَازٍ إِلَّا وَلَهُ حَقِيقَةٌ. And there is no word, that has a metaphorical meaning except that it has an origin in a literal sense, the author is saying. So what we already mentioned before. لِأَنَّا قَدْ بَيَّنَّا, because we already mentioned and we already explained, the author says, أَنَّ الْمَجَازَ, a metaphorical word, a metaphorical meaning, is مَا نُقِلَ عَمَّا وُضِعَ لَهُ, is anything that's been transferred away from its original intended meaning. وَمَا وُضِعَ لَهُ هُوَ الْحَقِيقَةِ, and its original intended meaning is the literal meaning. So a literal meaning is always the original intended meaning. Anything that goes away from the original intended meaning or the function, that's what we would refer to as a metaphor or al-majaz. How are we able to determine? How are we able to determine in the Quran or when we're reading hadith, how are we able to determine something which is metaphorical or something which is literal? How do we make that determination? The author is going to mention that now. So he mentions, وَيُعْرَفُ, and it could be understood, al-majazu min al-haqiqati biwujuh. So the author, he says, a metaphorical meaning or an understanding could be understood and it could be inferred from a literal meaning in different ways. Minha, amongst the ways the author he says, أن يصرحوا بأنه مجاز, that there's a clear-cut indication, or when you say sarih, it means it's clearly mentioned. Okay, this is not to be understood in the literal meaning. So the Prophet ﷺ tells you, or it's mentioned in the Quran as an example. وَقَدْ بَيَّنَ أَهْلَ اللُّغَةِ ذَلِكَ, and the people or the linguists, the author he says, has mentioned that, and they authored many books. وَصَنَّفَ أَبُو عُبَيْدَةَ كِتَابَ الْمَجَازِ فِي الْقُرْآنِ وَبَيَّنَ جَمِيعَ مَا فِيهِ مِنَ الْمَجَازِ. So there's been an entire book, okay, that's been written called Al-Majazu fil Quran from some of the early scholars. So there's different books. One of the main books is a book called Al-Majazu fil Quran, metaphor in the Quran. So that book, I don't think it's ever been translated into English. So that book, the author, he mentions all of the verses in the Quran, on all of the scenarios in the Quran in which metaphor is used. It's called Al-Majazu fil Quran. And the author, he mentions and he says, وَبَيَّنَ, and the author explains and clarifies جَمِيعَ مَا فِيهِ مِنَ الْمَجَازِ, everything that's mentioned in there relating to metaphor. وَمِنْهَا, the author says another way of understanding it is أَنْ يُسْتَعْمَلَ اللَّفْظُ فِي مَا لَا يَسْبِقُ إِلَى الْفَهْمِ عِنْدَ سَمَاعِهِ. The author says one way to understand or to indicate that metaphor is being used is that the word, when it's used in the context that it's used in a way in which in normal circumstances that's not the first thing that you would think of. So the way in which it's used, it's not the first thing. So for example, if you said to me, I saw a lion today, the first thing that comes to my mind, okay, you saw an animal. You saw the lion that we all know is a predatory animal. But you meant something else by it. That's not the first thing that came to my mind. So the author, he says, one way of finding out is that the first thing that comes to your mind is the original intended meaning of any word. If it's not that case, then that means it's often a metaphorical understanding. It could be different, obviously, because now you have so many things that influence language. And the author is going to come to that. So another discussion that's going to be coming up, inshallah, is what influence does culture have on language? That's something that comes in the Quran, that comes in this book, sorry. What influence does culture have on language? What influence does people's perceptions? What influence does analogy have? Can you use qiyas for language? All of that's going to come, inshallah. So the author says you use a word that in normal circumstances, as soon as you think about it, it's not the first thing that comes to your mind. That's one way of indicating that that's being used now because you didn't understand it straight away. It's not being used for its original intended meaning. In most likelihood, that's being used as a metaphor. And the author then he says, كَقَوْلِهِمْ, for example, when they say فِي الرَّجُلِ الْبَلِيدِ, when they say for somebody who's maybe a better example could have been given, but the author he says when there's a person who is known for being stupid is called himar, a donkey. So you say, I saw the donkey today. The first thing you're going to be thinking about is the animal. You're not going to be thinking about the person. But the person is intending a human being, an actual person. And the reason why he's calling him that is because he thinks he's a stupid person, or that's what he wants to call him. So that's an example. So then he says, وَمِنْهَا, and another way of understanding metaphor in Quran or in the tradition, أن يوصف الشيء, to describe something, أو يسمى بما يستحيل, to describe something or to name something with something which is impossible. Okay? بما يستحيل وجوده, with something which is impossible. And then he gives the example that we gave before, كقوله تعالى, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَاسْأَلِ الْقَرْيَةِ, ask the town. So that's impossible. You can't ask a town anything. You can ask the inhabitants of the town, you can ask people of the town, okay, but you can't ask the town itself. Okay? So the author says that's impossible. So you know from that it's impossible. That's one way of understanding. So then he says, وَمِنْهَا ألا يجري ولا يضطرد. There is no equilibrium in the way in which the wordings could be used. What does that mean? كقولهم, for example, the author says, كقولهم في الرجل الثقيل, when there's a big person or somebody who's a big human being, you call him Jabal, or this guy, he's a mountain. This person is a mountain. What is that referring to? When you call somebody a mountain, what do you think? What comes into your mind? What are you trying to say? He's big, okay? The author says, ثُمَّ لَا يُقَالُ ذَلِكَ فِي غَيْرِهِ, but you don't call that to anyone other than a human being. So for example, if you see a big rock, you're not going to use the word Jabal for the rock. That word, now it's being used as a metaphor, but it's only applicable in one way, one place. It can't be applicable to anywhere else. It's only applicable to a human being. Because you've made a meaning, a meaning now. You've created a meaning for this person. Therefore, لا يضطرد. It can't be utilized for any other example. So in that sense, it's restrictive and reductive. Does that make sense? It's restrictive in the way, so metaphor is restrictive in the way it's used. An original literal meaning could be used in every nakhla or every palm tree is known as a palm tree. Yes or no? See a palm tree in England and you see one in Arabia, if you see one in Indonesia, if you see one in Africa, they're all palm trees, isn't it? Yes or no? What if somebody, you know somebody who's tall and it's become a word which is accepted that this guy is a palm tree because he's so tall. And that's the new name now that it's formulated. Anyone who's tall is known as a palm tree. Can you use that for anything other than a human being? If, let's say, that meaning has become adopted now, it's become adopted. This person, oh yeah, he's a palm tree. Oh yeah, the palm tree person. We're talking about someone who's tall, it's a description now. That can only be used now for a human being. It's restrictive to the point that you can't use that description for, if you say palm tree, it has to refer to a human being. It can't refer to anything else that's tall. Is a building tall? Yes or no? A tall building, is it tall? A tall building, is it tall? Yes, it is, isn't it? Because it's a tall building. Can you say palm tree for the building? No, you can't. So it's restrictive in the way it's being used. So anything which is a metaphor has to be restrictive in the way it's being used. So what does this teach us about Quran? It teaches us that any time a metaphor is used, it's restrictive. And it cannot be utilized, nor can it be understood in that way unless there's an evidence. So the original understanding of everything in language, in Quran, is the original intended meaning. Everything else is secondary. So the original intended meaning is the primary understanding, everything else is secondary. And that which is secondary is often restrictive in the way it's applied, its application. So that's what the author means here. And then he gives an example. وَفِي الطَّوِيلِ, for the tall person, نَخْلَ. He says, ثُمَّ لَا يُقَالُ ذَلِكَ فِي غَيْرِ الْآدَمِ. He says, the tall person that you call a palm tree, you can't use that for anybody else. So it's restrictive in nature. Then the author, he says, وَمِنْهَا أَلَّا يَتَصَرَّفَ فِي مَا اسْتُعْمِلَ فِيهِ كَتَصَرُّفِهِ فِي مَا وُضِعَ لَهُ حَقِيقَةً. It cannot be utilized and employed, a metaphor cannot be utilized and employed in the same way that a literal word or literal meaning can be used. So for example, going back to the example that I gave you, if somebody is called, say for example now, you called somebody a donkey, what are you trying to say about that person? Why would somebody call a human being a donkey? You tell me. What are you trying to say about the person? He's what? He's what? He's a bit dumb. Or okay, that's usually why people use that as an insult, isn't it? Okay. Now you've used it to describe somebody who's foolish. Does that mean that person you're describing has to also bray like a donkey? Or is he only a donkey in the one thing that he resembles, which is people's perceptions of donkeys being stupid animals? It's just that one perception, isn't it? But because you called him a donkey, does he have to now walk on all fours? In order for you to make that application of the word donkey on this person, does he have to walk on all fours? Does he have to bray? Does he have to carry things on his back? So that means it's restrictive to one particular, very specific area in which the person is describing. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He mentions in the Quran, كَمَثَلِ الْحِمَارِ يَحْمِلُ أَسْفَارًا. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He uses the example of a donkey. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala uses that word, the example, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala uses it in a restrictive sense. Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is speaking about people who learn knowledge and have information, but they have no application. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, like the donkey who carries what? All of the load on its back. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala uses that in this specific situation or this specific example. So whatever metaphor is being used is always restrictive. So that's what the author he mentions here. It can't be utilized fully in the way a literal meaning can be utilized fully. So when the literal meaning of a donkey is an animal, it's on all fours, it brays, and maybe some people might describe it as not the most intelligent animal. But when you're using that word as a metaphor for another human being, it's very restrictive, because the only time you ever use that for a human being is either one of those things that we already mentioned. Does this make sense? So look, and the reason why the author is going very deep into this point is because he's showing you how complex language could be. And everything that's mentioned here is used in the Quran. All of the examples that the author mentioned here, they're all examples that are also used in the Quran. So none of these are examples which are exempt of actual examples in Quran. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions all of these. And this is language, and this is the medium in which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala chose to speak to us with. Therefore, is it important for us then to understand all of these complexities, for us to understand what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling us? Absolutely. So it's something which is extremely important. So all this is كَالْأَمْرِ فِي مَعْنَى الْفِعِلِ لَا تَقُولُ فِيهِ أَمْرَ يَأْمُرُ كَمَا. So this is really pretty much saying what we've already explained, inshallah. So I'm not going to go to this again, inshallah. So we finished the section related to the literal and the metaphor. Okay, so it's always going to be a recurring theme, and it's going to be continuing, inshallah. But we're going to enter into a new section, inshallah. The author says, "Babu bayan al-wujuh allati tu'khadhu minha al-asma' wal-lughat." So this section here is going to be speaking about the origin of language or names of things, and the different variations of words. Okay, so the origin of names and the variation of different words. Where does it originate from? Where does it come from? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He says in the Quran, وَعَلَّمَ آدَمَ الْأَسْمَاءَ كُلَّهَا ثُمَّ عَرَضَهُمْ عَلَى الْمَلَائِكَةِ فَقَالَ أَنْبِئُونِي بِأَسْمَائِهِمْ صَادِقِينَ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He mentions and He says, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala taught Adam alayhi salam all of the names of everything. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala taught him how to categorize things. So it's a type of categorization in which, for example, when Adam saw a tree, he understood that this is a genus of everything that looks something similar to it, has a similar function, is called such and such. So this is what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He taught Adam. So categorization and being able to understand something from its genus and being able to categorize that as a foundation for everything that comes after, this is something which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala taught human beings how to do. So it's important, especially here, because names is what's in the Quran. In the Quran, it's name. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala uses words. Okay, so the words in the Quran are intended to give and convey meanings. So we need to understand what those meanings are. How do we understand them? How do they originate? This is what the author is going to be speaking about here, inshallah. And we also can have influence on language and words. Can, like I said, qiyas, can analogy, because one word has been used in something, because this word or this issue or this action it's related somewhat to this action. Could you just use the name of this and apply it to that? That's what we call qiyas. Okay? Because two realities share something similar, can we just use the same name for both of them, even though they are distinct, but because they share some characteristics? That's how language has evolved in many times, and you'll find examples in Quran. Similarly, you will find also the Sharia. The Sharia came along and gave a new meaning to everything. So things, the concepts that existed beforehand, that it already existed, that had meanings, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala started using it for completely different meaning, for something completely different. That's also something. What about customary tradition, culture and tradition, and the society that you live in? What influence does that have on language? The author, he mentions and he says, اعلم أن الأسماء واللغات تؤخذ من أربع جهات. The author, he says, know that names and variation of different names and wordings and different dialects, all of that, the author, he says, all of that is taken and derives from 4 different things. So these are 4 things which influence language. The way we speak to each other, okay, every word that we use today is influenced by these things. So, min jihati al-lugha, the original intended word that was supposed to convey the meaning of that reality. The language. So an apple means an apple. Okay? An apple means an apple. A telephone means a telephone. Is it correct for me to call this telephone? Is that correct? Is this a telephone? Are you sure? Okay, it is. But is that the original word for this? What was the original word for this? In the beginning, when this first came out, was this called a telephone? It wasn't. It could have been called a cell phone, or it was called like a mobile phone. But why did we call it telephone? Why do we call it telephone now? Or why is it acceptable for us to call it a telephone? Because it shares characteristics with what? What does it share characteristics with? The original telephone. So that's an example of al-qiyas that's used. So that's an example of analogy influencing language. Because there's a similar characteristics, it adopts into it takes the entire name of something. Is that mentioned also in Quran? We're going to come to it, inshallah. The author then he says, فَأَمَّا اللُّغَةِ, as for the pure language, فَهِيَ مَا تُخَاطَبُ بِهِ الْعَرَبُ مِنَ اللُّغَاتِ وَهِيَ عَلَى ضَرْبَيْنِ. So the author, he says, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala revealed the Quran in the Arabic language, the author, he says that this is the language that is spoken, okay, the original language that is spoken, and that's divided into 2 things, into 2 categories. وَهِيَ عَلَى ضَرْبَيْنِ فَمِنْهَا مَا يُفِيدُ مَعْنًا وَاحِدًا, a word that can only have one meaning. Can only have one meaning. فَيُحْمَلُ, if it can only have one meaning, فَيُحْمَلُ عَلَى مَا وُضِعَ لَهُ اللَّفْظ, then that means its application and its understanding can only mean one thing. Okay? كَرَجُل, like a man, for example. When we say the word man, we understand what that means. When we say the word horse, we understand what that means. If we say the word at-tamr, we know what that means. When we say the word al-burr, we know what that means. So these are foods, okay? At-tamr, dates. Al-burr is wheat. So the actual seed of the grain, that's what we're talking about. وَغَيْرِ ذَلِكَ. So we know these words mean, they appropriate mean a meaning. That's simple as that. One meaning. The author then he says, you also have وَمِنْهُ مَا يُفِيدُ مَعَانِي, words that could mean different things. So you have a word that can only have one meaning, and I give you the example. What do you do with a word that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions in the Quran that can have more than one meaning? What do you do in those kind of situations? You have to look in the context. What if the context doesn't give away the meaning? Okay, look at it where it's used elsewhere. What if but if it's used elsewhere, is that an absolute guarantee that that's the meaning? It can give a meaning, absolutely, and it can give an indication as to what it means. But is that absolutely what it has to mean here? Because it means that over there, does that have to mean that it means that here? This is an interesting discussion. It could be. Okay. Yeah. Okay. How's it been, one of the ways is how it's been used before, absolutely, and how it's been understood before, absolutely. That is one way as well, inshallah. So jazakumullah khair. Here, a word like, for example, the word al-qur'. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He mentions وَالْمُطَلَّقَاتُ يَتَرَبَّصْنَ بِهِ أَنفُسُهُنَّ ثَلَاثَةَ قُرُوء. Allah uses the word qur'. What does that mean? According to some of the linguists, they say that word al-qur' means hayd. It means the menstrual cycle. Others, they say, no, it means the purity. It means purity rather than so it's the opposite of the menstrual cycle. It means both. So if that's the case, where do you put it? And that's been a huge difference that's caused a huge difference of opinion in Islamic jurisprudence. So that's one word that means two completely different things. So the author says, أحدهما, one of those is ما يفيد معاني, that which corresponds to many different meanings. كاللون, like the word alone, color. Something that incorporates many different things underneath it. So the concept of color, the color itself. The author says, كاللون يتناول السواد والبياض وسائر الألوان. The word color can incorporate many different things. So if I say to you the word color, you can understand from that many different, what color? It could be black, it could be white, it could be anything, it could be green, it could be purple, it could be so many different things. So that's one way of understanding as well. Though then he gives another example, and he says the word, then this is used in the Quran, إِنَّمَا الْمُشْرِكُونَ نَجَسٌ. وَالْمُشْرِك, the word mushrik. You know, what does mushrik mean? When we say the word mushrik, what does that mean? Anybody? You know this word very well. You hear it all the time. Sah? Sorry? No, not munafiq, mushrik. The word mushrik. Sorry? Like idol worship, people who worship more than one God, right? Like a polytheist. The author says, وَالْمُشْرِكُ يَتَنَاوَلُ الْيَهُودِ وَالنَّصْرَانِ فَيُحْمَلُ عَلَى جَمِيعِ مَا يَتَنَاوَلُهُ. According to the author, he's saying every single person who's categorized as a non-Muslim could fall under this category as well. Okay? So it doesn't necessarily just have to mean an idol worshipper. Could Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran, فَلَا يَقْرَبُوا الْمَسْجِدَ الْحَرَامَ بَعْدَ عَامِهِمْ هَذَا. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala only referring to somebody who bows down to an idol or anybody who's a non-Muslim. Who's Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala referring to in the verse? Anybody who's a non-Muslim. So you can see the word being employed in different ways. So it could have more than one meaning. So this is an example of a word that could have more than one meaning, and it's employed to have more than one meaning. What do you do in a situation where there's a fiqh ruling that needs to be established and you can't establish that unless you have the understanding of the word itself, like al-qur'? So the author, he says, so he mentions over here, وَالثَّانِي, bear with me, فَيُحْمَلُ عَلَى جَمِيعِ مَا يَتَنَاوَلُهُ. So the author, he says, those types of words, it could mean everything, it means everything that it's meant to mean. All of those words, it means all of them. So if I use that word, all of those meanings apply. Then he says, إِمَّا عَلَى سَبِيلِ الْجَمْعِ إِنْ كَانَ اللَّفْظُ يَقْتَضِي الْجَمْعِ. If the plural is used, that it means all of those groups, every single group that could be used to be described from that word would be included. أو على كل واحد منه على سبيل البدل. Or it could be used, okay, for every single group when it's being used in different places. إِن لَمْ يَقْتَضِي اللَّفْظُ الْجَمْعِ, if the word is not plural. إلا, the author says, except أن يدل الدليل على أن المراد به شيء بعينه. Unless evidence shows us that the word is being used for one specific group of people. If there's evidence to say that this word, which could be used to mean many things, is only meaning one thing, then there has to be evidence. For example, Imam Shafi'i, ثلاثة قروء, al-qur', when he said the word al-qur' means purity, he says he brought an evidence. And he said, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said ثلاثة قروء, then Allah subhanahu, and he gave an example from the hadith where a woman, as soon as she exited her last menstrual cycle, she was offered the position, she was offered be married again. So that shows that the three quru could only mean 3 cycles of purity. That's just an example, meaning he had to use evidence to suggest why it means X, Y, Z. Does that make sense? So you had to bring evidence and dalil. Then he says, فَيُحْمَلُ عَلَى مَا دَلَّ عَلَيْهِ الدَّلِيلِ. If there's a name which can mean more than one thing, then there has to be evidence if you want to use it, or if you want to utilize that to indicate one meaning, there has to be evidence that you have to show in order for that to be acceptable. وَالثَّانِي, he says, number 2, مَا يُفِيدُ مَعَانٍ مُخْتَلِفَةٍ. What if it has 2 completely different meanings? Sometimes it could have meanings which are similar. So the example I gave before, meanings which could mean something similar. Anyone who's a non-Muslim, this all comes under one category. It could be different. It could be from any different non-Muslim tradition or religion. All of them. Then you can have something, there's one word, it could mean 2 completely different things. And that's the example that I gave you of the hayd. Al-qur', it could mean hayd, it could mean menstrual cycle, or it can mean a period of purity. It could mean 2 completely different things. The author says, and he gives an example, and he says, kalbaydati, like the word egg. It could mean the egg of a chicken, wabidu dijaja, wabidu na'ama. It could mean the egg of a gazelle. It could mean the egg of any type of animal. All of those, but the word is the same, isn't it? So what's the distinction between all of them? If it's a chicken egg, or if it's an egg that's laid by does a gazelle lay an egg? An ostrich. If an ostrich lays an egg, and if a bird lays an egg, another bird lays an egg, what do they all have in common? That it's an egg. But is it the same egg? Is it the same one? Or snakes? Or any type of animal? Does it have the same meaning? Are they all the same in its reality? The egg is the same. The concept of the egg is the same. Yeah. Absolutely. But the word, we're talking about the word. Although the word is the same word that's used, the word is the same. But they're really different. Okay? And the reason why we call it that is because of our human experience, and it shows you how weak language is by its nature, is that we can't give a specific description to everything. So we have to categorize. So even though the reality is completely different, the egg of an ostrich isn't the same as the egg of a chicken. But we can't have 2 different names for it. We don't have 2 different names for both of them. We don't. So therefore we have to have this system of categorization, and that's what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He taught Adam alayhi wa 'allama Adam al-asma'a kullaha. That's what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala meant by that verse in the Quran. So then He says, وَالْقُرْءُ, the word I mentioned, al-qur'u yaqa'u 'ala al-hayd wa al-tuhr. The word al-qur' could refer to the menstrual cycle and the period of purity as well. فَإِن دَلَّ الدَّلِيلُ عَلَى أَنَّ الْمُرَادَ بِهِ وَاحِدٌ مِنْهُ بِعَيْنِهِ حُمِلَ عَلَيْهِ. And if the evidence shows that the meaning is for one of them specifically, there has to be evidence, just like we mentioned before. So then he says, وَإِن دَلَّ الدَّلِيلُ عَلَى أَنَّ الْمُرَادَ بِهِ أَحَدَهُمَا وَلَمْ يُعَيَّنْ لَمْ يُحْمَلَ عَلَى وَاحِدٍ مِنْهُمَا إِلَّا بِدَلِيلٍ. The author says, and if there's an evidence to show that the meaning of the word can only mean one thing, but we don't know which meaning it is. So for example, we know the word al-qur' could only refer to either a period of purity or the menstrual cycle, but we don't know which one. The author, he says, in those circumstances, لَمْ يُحْمَلْ عَلَى وَاحِدٍ مِّنْهُمَا إِلَّا بِدَلِيلٍ. We're not allowed to make that application unless we have evidence. And that's a very sensible thing to say, because we don't know the exact meaning. We know it means it could either mean this or it could mean that. But because we don't know for sure, we're not going to make that application. We just have to take a step back. That's what the author is saying. Only when we have an evidence to say, okay, it can only mean this, then that's when we make the application. That's what the author is saying over here. And he gives his justification and he says, إِذْ لَيْسَ أَحَدُهُمَا بِأَوْلَى مِنَ الْآخَرِ. The reason why is because one meaning or one application isn't more deserving than the other. it could mean one of the two. Because it could only mean one of the two, and you don't know which one it is, then to make the application to one is something which is unfair. So the author, he says, one understanding or one application isn't given preference over the other. The author says, وَإِن لَمْ يَدُلَّ الدَّلِيلُ عَلَى وَاحِدٍ مِنْهُمَا حُمِلَ عَلَيْهِمَا عِنْدَ بَعْضِ أَصْحَابِنَا. What if there's no evidence to suggest it could be either one of them? So you have something which is a word, okay? It could mean more than one thing, but there is no evidence to show that it could mean any of them. What about in those circumstances? So you have the example that I gave you before. You have evidence that it could be one of the two things, but you don't know which one it is. So there's evidence. It could mean this or it could mean that. Or we know for a fact it could only be either what? The menstrual cycle, or it could mean the cycle of puberty. Can't be anything else. So we know that it means one of the two, but we don't know which one. In those circumstances, you don't make any application. What if there's no evidence to say it could be any of the two? In terms of, okay, you take the literal meaning. What if the literal meaning doesn't give any indication? So all of the procedures have been applied. The author, he says, وَإِن لَمْ يَدُلَّ الدَّلِيلُ عَلَى وَاحِدٍ مِنْهُمَا حُمِلَ عَلَيْهِمَا. In those circumstances, it means both. What can you do? And the author, he says, that's according to an opinion of some of our companions, meaning some of the Shafi'iyah. That's the opinion that they hold. Meaning, if we don't have any evidence to say that it could mean any of them, then in those circumstances, it has to mean both. Then he says, وَقَالَ أَصْحَابُ أَبِي حَنِيفَةَ. But the people who uphold the Hanafi tradition, and some of the people who hold the school of al-i'tizal, meaning the Mu'tazila tradition, they say لا يجوز حمل اللفظ الواحد على معنيين مختلفين. They say, no, it's impermissible for one word to be utilized for two different meanings. So you have the opinion that the author, he says, and he attributed to some of the Shafi'iyah, and he said, if there's a situation that we, for whatever reason, cannot have any evidence that this word could be applied to any of the two meanings, we apply it to both. The other opinion of Imam Abu Hanifa and some of the Mu'tazila, they say, no, one word could not mean two different things. Impossible. He retorts, Imam Abu Ishaq Ash-Shirazi says, وَالدَّلِيلُ عَلَى جَوَازِ ذَلِكَ. He says that actually the reason why that is perfectly permissible is أَنَّهُ لَا تُنَافِي بَيْنَ الْمَعْنَيَيْنِ. There is no reason why it cannot embrace both meanings. وَاللَّفْظُ يَتَحَمَّلَهُمَا. And the word has enough ability and capacity to be able to have more than one meaning. Can a word have more than one meaning? In the way is there words that we use today in human language that could have more than one meaning? If I say to you the word clothing, could mean many things, right? If I say to you the word phone, it could be, you could understand it in many, many different ways. This is without looking at whether it's or the way it's been, or the word originated and all of that kind of stuff, but it means more than one thing. Let's say, for example, you had a word which you couldn't apply anywhere at all, but you know it could mean one of two things. It could mean this or it could mean that, but you don't know where to apply it, and you have no evidence to say it applies here or it applies there. According to some of the usuliyin, they say it applies to both. Both of them can be used. You can use the name for both of them. According to some of the Ahnaf and some of the Mu'tazila, they say you can't do that, because according to their understanding, is one word could only mean one thing, and that's it. You can't have one word that has two different meanings. But Imam Abu Ishaq Ash-Shirazi is saying that's not correct. You can, in fact, have one word that has more than one meaning. And he says the evidence of that is, and he's giving his argument, he says, أَنَّهُ لَا تُنَافِي بَيْنَ الْمَعْنَيَيْنِ. He goes, there's nothing to suggest that there's a contradiction in having more than one name more than one thing being used by one name. And the word can incorporate that. Then he says, فَوَجَبَ الْحَمْلُ عَلَيْهِمَا, it becomes incumbent then to be able to use that word for more than one thing. كَمَا قُلْنَا فِي الْقِسْمِ الَّذِي قَبْلَهُ, like we mentioned in the previous chapter. So the main argument that the author is making, alayhi rahmatullah, is that one word can mean, and he gave examples before, can give more than one meaning. And because it can give more than one meaning, how do you apply that in the Sharia? So for example, if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he mentions al-qur' to mean the menstrual cycle, and it means also the cycle of purity, only if we have evidence can we give a suggestion as to how that works. If we have no evidence, then we have to accept that it means both. Imam Shafi'i, Imam Ahmad, they both accept that al-qur' means both. But they both have evidence and they say, but we have evidence that it means this. Imam Ahmad says, I have evidence to show that al-qur' means al-hayd. Imam Shafi'i says, I have evidence to show that al-qur' means al-tuhur. Which is why they made the application that they did. Had they not made the application, had they not that evidence, they would have not made that application. The only reason why they made that application is because they had an evidence. Otherwise, both of them accepted that it means both. So they said, they both held the opinion that the word al-qur' means two completely different meanings, and that's perfectly fine. This is where Imam Shafi'i and Imam Ahmad go against the opinions of some of the people of the school of al-i'tizal and some of the companions of Imam Abu Hanifa, who say that one word could only incorporate one meaning. If it's more than one meaning, it cannot be incorporated. There cannot be one word that's used as a resource. It has to have different words. Different words mean different things. So one word cannot be utilized. Which one do you think? Which one do you think is more correct? What's your preference? MashaAllah, أنتم العلماء أيضا إن شاء الله بإذن الله في المستقبل إن شاء الله. إن شاء الله. Which one do you think you feel makes more sense to you? Yes. 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 Yeah. Yes. Yeah. As in, do you mean like the word you accept that they mean it could mean more than one meaning? They accept that it means more than one meaning, but it can only be applied in one area with evidence. Absolutely, that's what it is. Yeah. No, the meaning, according to the Shafi'iyya, is that this word or this meaning here is accepted that they have more than one meaning. So for example, Imam Shafi'i, he says, the best example is al-qur'. They use it because that's the one which is the most common. And it's utilized a lot of the times because divorce is something that happens commonly, unfortunately. So the word al-qur', it means both, and they accept it means both, and there's not any that has more right over the other in terms of how we understand its meaning. Al-qur', the word means hayd and it means tuhur. It means both equally. However, in the application, the only reason why I apply it here is because we have an external evidence that shows that this is what is meant by it. Does that make sense? So that's what is meant by it. It means, so according to Imam Shafi'i, al-qur' means al-tuhur. Why does it mean al-tuhur? Because we have evidence to show that that's what it's meaning. Could that be because of context, because of evidence? Absolutely. It could mean because of that's the hadith. The hadith shows that al-qur', for example, the hadith where as soon as she finished her last cycle of purity, then she was able to be married. Which shows what? Which shows that ثلاثة قروء. She finished all of her quru'. Therefore, al-quru' could only mean purity. So that's the evidence that he used to say that that's what it means. At least that's what it means according to the understanding of the hadith that we have. In the language, you can have something that means more. You can have in the language something that means more than one thing. But what's the thing that makes us because this is usul al-fiqh and it has a relevance to fiqh. How do we make that application in fiqh? Does that make sense? How do we apply it in a real fiqh situation? Why does Imam Shafi'i say al-qur'? Can he say that without evidence? Or can he not? Or does he have to have evidence for him to say is a tuhur? He has to have evidence, isn't it? Without evidence, there's no way that he could make that application. Similarly with the Hanabila, they use the exact same formula. They both agree that the word means two completely different. It can mean both. It means both equally. But they have evidence. They say they have evidence that it means hayd. Therefore, that's how they apply it in fiqh. Their application of that in fiqh is not to say that it doesn't mean more than one thing. So their application isn't to say, for example, Imam Shafi'i's application doesn't mean, he's saying that al-qur' doesn't mean al-hayd. Does that make sense? He says in the lugha, yes, that's what it means both. But in the application, in the shar'i meaning, it means what? Why? Because of evidence. Does that make sense? Is that what you meant, isn't it?
Yeah, but then that understanding.
Okay.
I feel like they're not saying that it doesn't become.
Yeah.
They have evidence, then they would draw that from the language. That's why they
Okay, that's possible. Yeah. Usually, Imam Shafi'i, the main evidence that he uses is lugha. Many a time. So, for example, in fiqh, you'll see that whenever it comes to certain wordings, especially when it comes to language, he uses that as one of his most important ways of understanding what the origin of words and what it could mean. So, for example, like how do you break wudu? Naqdul wudu. So he mentions, for example, according to the madhab, if you make skin-to-skin contact with a woman from the opposite gender, that breaks the wudu. Because he got that from an understanding of something related to the language. إِذَا أَفْضَى أَحَدُكُمْ. And he mentioned the word fada. So he mentioned لا يكون الإفضاء إلا بباطن الكف. He said the word he mentioned نقض الوضوء when you touch the private parts. So he said الإفضاء لا يكون إلا بباطن الكف. He said you cannot, he goes, because it's breaking the wudu, it can only happen if it's from the palm of the hands. If it's anything of the exterior, that doesn't break the wudu if it comes into contact with the private parts. But if it's anything like that, when you go like that with your hands, anything that's covered, that breaks the what? The wudu. Anything that's covered now, if that comes into contact with the private parts, that breaks the wudu. Why? Because he used one word in the hadith which gave him that understanding. So usually Imam Shafi'i, what he does is he focuses mainly on lugha and also the different madahib. So sometimes he could use different madahib. But I don't know if that's what he uses in this for his evidence, if he uses the Ahnaf for his evidence. He was a student of Muhammad bin Hassan, so possibly, maybe, Allahu A'lam. I'm not sure. It could be. But over here, the author, he says, وَقَالَ أَصْحَابُ أَبِي حَنِيفَةَ, the Imam Abu Hanifa, and he attributes this to the madhab of Imam Abu Hanifa, and he also attributes it to some of the Mu'tazila. He says, لا يجوز حمل اللفظ الواحد على معنيين مختلفين. So he says it can't mean one word could only mean more than one. One word could only mean one meaning. One word could not mean more than one meaning. It has to have one meaning. So that's what it says. Does that apply in the Hanafi madhab's understanding of al-hayd? And Allahu A'lam, I'm not sure. I'm not an expert on the Hanafi madhab to mention that. So that I'm not, Allahu A'lam. But this is just an usuli perspective. So is that what it means? Allahu A'lam. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best. Are there any other questions? Does that make sense? Are there any other questions, inshallah? Yes. The only reason why they would say something completely different is because they have their own evidence as well. So for example, in some of the riwayat of Imam Ahmad, they do have traditions as well in which it indicates or it does show that the word al-qur could also mean al-hayd. What would be interesting is actually check out some of the tafasir, especially what al-Qurtubi in his tafsir of the verse of the Quran wal-mutallaqat in Surah Al-Baqarah. The ayat of talaq, if you read it, inshallah, he gives you all of the different opinions, even related to the language, the origin, and the different madahib, and what they say and what their justifications are. So they're all legitimate. And the word could mean more than one meaning, which is something which is really interesting. Okay? Is there an example like that in English, by the way? Where you can have one word which means two completely different things, like literally opposites. Yes. Okay. Foot in what, sorry? Yeah. Okay, so in terms of the measurement, so the actual foot, which is the body part, and the foot, which is the measurement. So there are two different things, but what in the sense of two things which contradict each other. Those two things, they don't contradict each other. Like your feet, which is part of your body, and the foot, those are two, absolutely. But this contradicts each other. The word qur is one word which signifies two different meanings which contradict each other completely. Like both of them cannot be reconciled with each other. It could mean when the woman's in a state of her period, or when she's in a state when she's not on her period. So they contradict each other. You can't reconcile both at all under any circumstances. But the same word is used. Is there equivalent in English? I don't know. Allahu alam. That's for you lot to find out for us, inshallah. So they all have their evidences. Nobody would make any claim or any opinion without having sufficient evidence to show that that's the case. So it's actually just a very legitimate way to say it's actually one of those issues. And this is one of the miracles of the Sharia, because it does mean both. And you have traditions and ahadith that signify both. So both are correct. In what sense? Okay, you mean the prayer times, the awqat. When it comes to the different awqat, for example, you have the jumhur who have one opinion where, for example, the Asr prayer comes at one specific time, which is an earlier time than what some of the Ahnaf, and it's not all of the Ahnaf. There is within the Hanafi madhab those who also even some attribute to some of the students of the madhab of Imam Abu Hanifa himself, where the prayer time comes in at the length of the shadow of the object and a small addition. So that's the same opinion as the Jumhur, okay, the majority opinion. So there are differences of opinion, and all of them have their evidences. So even the opinion or the madhab that says that the beginning of the Asr prayer begins at double the shadow length, that has its evidence also. But this is a completely different issue, because that's just a different opinion in terms of different ahadith. And because of the different ahadith, we're talking about the differences of opinion that's born out of an issue related to the language, of an actual wording that could mean two completely different things. And those two completely different things cannot be reconciled. It's two complete opposites. Yeah. Well, I mean, people would dispute that. So some people would say, I believe my evidence is stronger than your evidence. So they would dispute that so if you bring an evidence and somebody else brings another evidence, and you believe your evidence is stronger, and they believe their evidence is stronger, then what do you do in those circumstances? Do you try and convince them that their evidence and your evidence is stronger? Okay, maybe you can do that. But what if they still disagree and they say, actually, but thank you for letting me know. Now I'm even more convinced that my evidence is stronger. What if they say that, for example? What do you do then? Who will be the ones who make the examination? But who are they? And who determines the one who can make the final call? Is there any final call in fiqh? Is there anyone who's the end-all be-all sheikh? That is the one who, wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullah, the person whom there is no who can close all of the doors for every subject. That doesn't exist. It doesn't exist at all, because you have to realize that these are traditions. Traditions exist. People or scholars who can either open a topic or close a topic off don't exist. We're talking about traditions which are alive. These traditions are alive and they continue until the Day of Judgment. So nothing is closed forever. Even the concept of ijma', even though it's an evidence and it's an accepted evidence, its application is impossible. And people have tried so hard to allow, and we're going to come to it inshallah later on in the book, the whole concept of ijma', but its application had to be worded down and watered down so much because of how impossible it is to apply. Can anybody make a call that every single scholar has ever agreed on anything, on one thing? Some of the scholars say, okay, that we can't ever come to that arrangement, or that, that's impossible. So therefore we have to say, okay, what do the people of Medina, what did they agree upon? We'll call that ijma'. Or what did the people of Basra and Kufa and Mecca and Medina, what they say to be, what they agree on is ijma'. Or what the Sahaba say, this is only in the time of the Sahaba. So you close it off, because in actual reality it's impossible. But it's there, it's an evidence. And everybody agrees that it's an evidence. But how do you apply it? So just that applying itself shows you that ijma' itself is not ijma'. Does that make sense? There is no ijma' on the topic of ijma'. What does that tell you? The concept of ijma', there is no ijma' on the concept of ijma'. Ijma' means different things to different ulama. So that means, can ijma' ever really be done? If you think about it, really think long and hard, it's impossible for there to be an ijma'. We study the concept and we understand how it works, but its application is impossible. And that's just something that everybody has to accept, because that's just the reality. And even if every scholar on the face of the earth all did agree on something, that could never be determined. Did you ask that one sheikh or alim who lives in a hut somewhere in Siberia, who lives outside of civilization, lives off the grid, nobody knows he even exists? Did you get his opinion? You see how problematic it is then? That's why Imam Malik said, the only ijma' I consider is the people of Medina. That's it. Some of the other ulama, I only consider the companions of the Prophet ﷺ. Their ijma' is the only one. Anyone else doesn't count. Some of our scholars, they said, the Mecca, Medina, Basra, Kufa, those 4 cities, those are the only ijma' that counts. Any other ijma' doesn't count. So nobody can close off any door, really, if you think about it. Inshallah, when that happens, inshallah, let us know, inshallah, when that day comes, inshallah. Are there any other questions, inshallah? Yes. That's a very good question. So the author in this book, he mentions different theological groups, and I mentioned this before in the beginning when we first started the book. So the author, he mentions the different theological groups, and he mentions also different different fiqhi juristic schools as well. The reason why he mentions it is because all of these groups have invested a lot of knowledge and a lot of time into the knowledge of usul al-fiqh. So all of their opinions, for example, this science actually, obviously it started with Imam Shafi'i, but the people who actually made this science, the people who actually transformed and made it an actual science the way it's studied today, were the Mu'tazila, in actual fact. So it's an unbelievable contribution that they made. You can't study usul al-fiqh without taking their opinions and studying their opinions, because they are one of the people who invested a huge amount of time. Doesn't mean they're correct in their opinions, doesn't mean you agree with them in their theological positions or their positions in aqeedah or anything like that. That's completely different. But this as a science, because it's something that they've incorporated, and they had invested many of the opinions that they have, which are many of them are correct, by the way. Ibn Taymiyyah himself, who was the furthest away, very far away from the Mu'tazila, he holds many of the opinions of the Mu'tazila as his own opinions. So, for example, whenever you hear the opinions of the nature of good and evil, this is something which is really outside of usul al-fiqh, but usually they mention it in the books of usul al-fiqh. The position of Ibn Taymiyyah goes against the mainstream Sunni Islamic, the mainstream Sunni opinion, and he takes the position of the Mu'tazili opinion. That's actually the one which is the most correct. And he does that for quite a few opinions as well. So you cannot discard or disregard the Mu'tazila in this science, because they were the ones who created the science, pretty much. Them, and also later on, obviously, the school of Imam Abu Hasan al-Ash'ari, who were the main. So four of the main books are books of Ahlul Kalam. Yes. Yes, so you had different communities. You had the.
So who are you referring to when you say old community? That's the word you used last.
Which one? Sorry.
You said the Mu'tazila with the old community. Like you said that like 5 weeks.
The old community. Did I use that word?
Yeah, I wrote down. That's what I wrote down.
The old community.
Yeah, so that's what I put down. So
Allahu A'lam. I'm not sure what I meant by that, if I said that. I mean, what I would say is that the Mu'tazila had different communities within different regions. So, for example, you had the Mu'tazila of Basra, you had the Mu'tazila of Kufa, you had the Mu'tazila of Baghdad. They had different opinions within themselves. So not all of the Mu'tazila themselves had the same opinions. You had the Mu'tazila who were in Basra, you had the ones who were in Baghdad, you had the remnants of them who were in the Hijaz, and all of them had different opinions. They agreed with each other on the fundamentals. When it comes to usuli positions and some of the different fiqh issues, there were some variations and differences between the different schools. So maybe that's what I meant. But that's just a guess. I'm not sure. Allahu A'lam. Wallahu A'lam. Yes. 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 Yeah. Yes. Yes. How is that metaphor? So, for example, the kaf, can that make? Okay. So the word kaf, when you add it onto mithlihi, does that signify a change in the meaning, or does that signify that addition? Does it signify something else within the meaning? So much so that it's used after that. So if somebody were to say laysa kamithlihi shay and laysa mithlihi shay, they mean two completely different things. Kaf could, like any word could be used, like kaf could be used to add many things. So, for example, I'm thinking of a good example outside of laysa kamithlihi shay. Okay, let's just take the ayah in Quran, laysa kamithlihi shay. That kaf, if you were to take it away, does it mean the same thing? Does it mean the same thing, or it doesn't mean the same thing? If you add the kaf. Yeah. A deeper meaning, sir? But does it also have this the same kind of meaning as well? The same thing, sir? Okay, so that kaf, why is that there then? Why is the kaf there then, if that's the case? No, but adding the kaf adding a harf onto a word that's not needed for it to be added there. Why did that happen? It could be because of emphasis, but the asl meaning doesn't change. Does that make sense? Why is it added then? There was no need for that addition. The fact that the author is saying that the reason why it's just added there, that in of itself is a metaphor. So just adding something onto a word where that style is not used, that way, that's not the way people would say it. Because the method in which the meaning, that's not the way it's supposed to be said, makes it into a metaphor. That's what the author is trying to say. So his argument is adding the harf onto somewhere in that way that it was done by Allah in laysa kamithlihi shay', that's not the normal way of doing it. Because of the way that it was done, it's not the original intended way. So it falls into the categorization of metaphor. So he's saying that addition. But I know in the sense of meaning and non-meaning and all of that kind of stuff, it doesn't have the same meaning as was'al al-qarya and that kind of stuff. But what the author is saying is that kaf is not the original way in which it should be written. So the reason why it's written in that way shows that it's a metaphor. So what does he mean? So I think the word metaphor is where we get confused. Majaz doesn't only mean just the English word metaphor. It means anything. It means something that goes outside of the original intended form or meaning and its application. So the way it's applied here, the author says, "Wal kafu za'ida," meaning it's not supposed to be there. Does that make sense? So in that sense, that's what the author is trying to say. As for the taqdeem wa ta'khir, it's the same thing. So when it comes to the taqdeem wa ta'khir, there's a way of saying it. So it's supposed to be وَالَّذِي أَخْرَجَ الْمَرْعَى أَحْوَى فَجَعَلَهُ غُثَاءً. That's how it's supposed to be. But the whole taqdeem wa ta'khir, employing it in such a way, is metaphorical. So for example, if I say to you, وَالَّذِي أَخْرَجَ الْمَرْعَى, the one who caused the pasture to come out and caused it to dissipate and to deteriorate, and it was strong and green and luscious. In that way, that's majaz. Because that understanding, it's very, it cannot be, in the sequence, no sequence works that way. But because we know what the meaning is, we already understand the meaning. Like Laysa Kamithlihi, we understand the meaning. And this we understand the meaning, but we know for a fact that there's a play with the words that makes it fall into the category of al-majaz. So anything that goes outside of the original intended meaning, anything that goes in outside of the original sequence, formation of wordings, all of that falls into what? Al-majaz. Those all considered to be majaz in the science. So it's not only this word means this, but now it means that, which is, because English is a very weak way of using words to convey what something means. So even using the word metaphor is problematic, because what we're trying to speak about here incorporates metaphor and much more than that. It means an entire change of the way wordings are formulated, words are constructed, meanings of words, the way it's written, the way it's spoken. So is there an original language in the way it's formulated, spoken, everything? This is what the authors are speaking about here. Does that make sense? I know it might be a bit confusing, I understand, but that's what the author is trying to say here. Wallahu a'lam. Any other question? Did that make sense though? Any other question, inshallah? Khair, inshallah. Barakallahu fikum, inshallah. See you all, inshallah, next week.